We're here to talk about a lean approach to portfolio and budgeting management. And in order to have that lean approach, you need to start stopping. So first, we'll just talk about who we are, say hello to you. I'd like to introduce my colleague, Randy Hale. Randy and I have worked together quite a lot, off and on through the years at several clients. Randy is a fantastic coach and executive leader. He is actually someone that works really well with executives, and he's actually someone that can say no to an executive and they'll thank him later. He does a really great job of pointing out the real hard truths, so you can trust him to tell you what's really going on. And Randy is, if you've ever been anywhere near a karaoke bar and Randy's nearby, you know you will find him there. He's a great karaoke singer.
Thanks, Sally. And allow me to introduce my friend and colleague, Sally Tait. Probably my favorite thing about Sally, professionally anyway, is the background that she brings and the pragmatism. She's been a more traditional PMO and portfolio leader. She's gone through the journey that many of you are likely in some stage of, and she's got lots of great stories and examples and experiences to share. And I think that really makes her impactful. Sally, about a little over a year ago, moved to Scotland. So pretty big life change there. And she enjoys doing things with her family and enjoying their new surroundings. So with that, that's a little bit about us.
So a lot of what we're going to focus on today is about value. There are different types of value when we say that to consider. We have, obviously, customer value is the one that we talk about the most. Other types of value to consider are shareholder value. There's learning value. What are you learning? What kind of experiments do you have? How do you keep your product growing? And then there's operational value. You might need to address some technical debt. You might need to maintain some things. There are other types of value as well. These are some of the main ones to think about as we're talking about that today. So with that in mind, we would like to we're going to take a poll real quick. I can get this to go forward. There we are. So we have a poll. We'd like to hear what your thoughts are. What is preventing your organization from delivering value? We have a link in the chat that you can click on. You can also use this QR code to click on that and get to that poll. You can answer one thing. What's the number one thing that is preventing your organization from delivering value? These are your options. Could be a lack of understanding customer needs, frequently changing requirements. I'm sure that sounds familiar to many of you. One near and dear to my heart is everything is a priority. We've got 100 things in progress right now. Misalignment between business and IT. What are some of the things when you look at this list? What's the number one thing that is preventing your organization from delivering value? Got 12 answers. If you're having any trouble getting to the poll, just pop something in the chat, let us know. Can't find the chat, it's at the bottom of your Zoom window. There should be a chat button, and if you open that up, then you'll get to the link that's at the top of the screen as well. 15 answers. We'll look at what we're getting in just a minute. You might have resource constraints. Many things could prevent you from responding to changing market opportunities. Maybe some of these other things. All right, 20 answers. Let's see what we've got so far. There we are. Oh, wow. So everything is a priority is the winner here. Well, winner, I'm going to put that in air quotes. Having too much WIP, very common. We see that with a lot of the organizations we work with. Also, misalignment between business and IT. A lot of times the priority might be driven by one or the other, and they're not in agreement. So teams are left not really sure, and they're going to make their own decisions about what the actual value is that they're trying to deliver or what the priorities are.
All right. So the first stop is we want you to stop working on things where critical assumptions are wrong. At least stop long enough to assess what is different. One of the things that we see very often is something that lines up with an anecdote that I'm going to share about a client that I worked with years ago, where there was a really well-known story within that organization about this really big opportunity that they had. And this was a smaller growing organization. And given their current market offerings and customer mix, they identified one opportunity that in the business case, they basically positioned that if we can deliver this thing by July 1st of this coming year, by the end of the year, we will get $5 million in additional new sales, which would have been massive. So coming out of the business case and the approval to move forward, this project basically, became synonymously referred to as the $5 million project. And they were totally focused on how do we get this done? How do we get it into the market? How do we hit our goal of getting it in the market by July 1st so we can get those $5 million in new sales by the end of the year? So the good news is they hit their major milestones from a build out perspective and a launch perspective, got it into the market, executed everything after the launch as they planned. And they found that at the end of the year, they had exactly $0 in new sales out of their big new strategic opportunity. So what went wrong? The first thing is they built a hypothesis into the business case, but once the business case got approved, everybody forgot about the assumptions. Everybody focused on the $5 million in new sales, and let's get this thing delivered so that we can get those $5 million in new sales and help our customers along the way. So we want to make sure that we have a clear hypothesis for a given investment, and we're really focusing on what must be true for the assumptions that went into this business case that got this thing through the vetting process, and we have now committed to the time and energy and dollars to build this thing. What needs to be true for that to continue to be a worthwhile investment, and make sure that we are monitoring those things. By having clarity of the hypothesis and those assumptions, we can start to think through what are the leading indicators? What are the first things that we will see that will be evidence that the problem that we're trying to solve is actually being solved, that the behaviors we expect to see that lead to the impact or the business outcome that we're trying to deliver are actually going to happen. And let's focus on those things. We want to be clear on what we can observe, and we want to make sure that we're not just planning and monitoring those things after launch, but even while we're building it. So thinking through how can we get feedback more frequently, more often? How do we move that, the leading indicator insights forward? And the insights is the important thing. So once we have a strategy that says, here is how we're going to understand whether or not our leading indicators are true. So in the case of the story that I just shared, being able to understand by engaging with actual customers around some earlier designs or even earlier builds of the solution, really aligning on here's the problem that we're trying to solve, getting feedback, understanding, is that really the problem you need solved? Is what we're doing solving that problem? Is the problem slightly different? Do we have the problem wrong? Do we have the solution wrong? But getting that feedback early and often, shifting that feedback left, if you will, in the process, so that we can learn and get those insights. And then once we have those insights, making decisions on an ongoing basis. So the story that I shared there, the only decisions that were happening throughout the build leading up to the market launch was, are we on time? Are we on budget? Are we gonna make our target date? There were very few decisions, no decisions really, around, are we actually building the right thing? Are we solving the right problem? Are we solving it in a way that we're going to create the impact that our customers need? So making sure that these decisions are baked into how we're working on a consistent basis. And so if we think about this through the metrics and reporting lens, metrics and reporting drives a lot of the discussion that happens around the investments that we're making and the progress. One of the things we see very consistently is metrics and reporting has a lot of information, such as how are we doing on our spend? What's our spend variance? How are we doing on our overall schedules and our schedule variance? How are we tracking from a quality and a launch readiness perspective? One of the things that is really powerful, I'm a big fan of this because I think it's fairly simple, it's visual, which is helpful, but I personally am a big fan of the cone of uncertainty to help drive the right conversations when we're in a program level review, portfolio level review, whatever level you're operating at, to really understand, for a given investment, do we know where we are in the cone of uncertainty? Because in the example that I gave earlier, while they weren't really looking at it through this lens, they probably would have guessed that they were in the green area there, where the range of outcomes is fairly narrow because we've worked through all the uncertainty. We did all the work in the business case. We know these things. We know what our customers need. So that's another challenging aspect of this, is not being overconfident in where you are in the cone of uncertainty. But one of the things when we're having a review of our investments and how we're doing, and we're teeing up decisions to make based on those insights, I'm also a big fan of the second question here. What needs to happen to progress through the cone of uncertainty for a given investment? And the bullets that follow here, have we validated or invalidated any of our value assumptions? So presumably, we decide what to invest in because we have some return or impact of this investment. And when we look at that return in relation to the time and the dollars cost aspect of it, there's a positive correlation. There's good return on investment. But if we have big assumptions in either the numerator, which is the value, or the denominator, which is the cost, that could greatly change where that investment ranks overall. So making sure that we're really ingraining that into how we work on a consistent basis, that we're going after these assumptions. We're going after minimizing that risk by taking it on, head on. And then the last four questions here, what is the feedback that we're getting? Do we need to pivot? And, maybe even more than that, do we need to completely either park and rethink this investment, or maybe do we know enough now to say we should just pull the plug altogether? But regardless, when you get an insight that potentially validates a critical assumption or invalidates one, more importantly, at that point, the business case changed. The argument that we made to make this investment is different now. And we need to understand that everything we've done so far is sunk cost, and we've got a new investment decision to make, whether we're a third of the way through it or 80% of the way through it. We now have to look at, from this point forward, continuing on this path, whether it be a minor pivot or a more major refactor. Is this new investment worth continuing? Because sometimes it's not. All right.
So how do you know if you're working on the right things? Something that comes to mind for me is a story that I was working in a large division of a Fortune 100 company. I was leading portfolio management. So I was the keeper of the list of projects. One thing I noticed was that some of the larger initiatives, some of the top priority initiatives weren't moving. They would be on the list quarter after quarter and even year after year. And that was for various reasons. It was because there were things that kept getting added to it. Before we could launch it, we needed to add a few more features, or there were impediments that were hard to resolve, or things like that. The other thing that we noticed was that not on the list, there were quite a few shadow projects, as we called them. So the shadow projects are the ones that they didn't get a lot of attention, but they would suddenly pop up as getting done. And they were something that was potentially valuable or very visible. But the shadow projects were things that the teams would be working on, but they wouldn't be on the list. We had one VP especially who was she was known for getting stuff done. She got the hard stuff done. She had a passionate project manager that knew how to get those things done. One quarter, that project manager got an award for getting something done that was, it was a surprise, like, oh, this is great. He got this done. It was really hard. The VP put him in for the award. Executives were all excited about it. And I was sitting there going, I've never even heard of this project. It doesn't sound familiar to me. I went back to my desk and I looked at the list, and it was like 70th on the list. And that was really low on the list. So I was like, well, why is that one getting done and getting awarded and all of these things when it was considered not to be even a top priority? And yet these high priority things weren't getting done. So that was getting in the way. That was, teams were focused on that instead of getting the larger and bigger and higher value project done. And so we really started looking at, how do we stop working on those lower value things? And there are a few things to consider when you're trying to make this happen. One is having holistic, ongoing prioritization. So soon after that, we did start to put this practice into place. And what this means is having all leaders of the product or the value stream, or there are different names for these things. You want IT and business. It's got to be cross-organizational. You want many points of view. You want architects involved. You want designers involved. You want the product leaders, the hardware, software, all involved in this conversation so that they're aligned on what is valuable and which initiatives do we want to put at the top of the list. And that is an ongoing conversation that needs to happen. And then you want to consider scope optionality. So when you're looking at that list, what items have scope that actually might not be as important? So where can you cut the line to get things out the door and start to get feedback from your customers, from users of your applications, from your stakeholders, whoever is getting that value? Where can you cut that line so you can get that feedback as soon as possible? Where's the optional scope? And then the last thing is, can you trim the tail? So you start having releases. Each of these lines indicates a release. You get the highest value at some point, and then it starts to diminish a little bit. You're still adding value, but it starts to get lower and lower. And at some point you want to trim that tail and move your people to working on higher value things. So one of the mechanisms that's really useful, Randy and I've used this with several clients and in our own organizations, is to do value scoring. It helps you make quick collaborative decisions. And there are a few steps to take to do this. First, you would need to get the right group of executives from business, technology, all those groups to make, they need to be people that are high enough up that they can make very quick investment decisions. They need to align on what is value, what are the drivers of value, and then make a list of all the work in progress. All of them get together on a regular basis to score. everything on that list and agree on it, have conversation about it, ask hard questions about it, and then make that list fully visible. Always easy to find. It should be changing all the time. Your priorities are going to change because of customer needs, maybe because something is finished, maybe because something got bigger or smaller. Those priorities will constantly change. So have that meeting regularly, keep it published, make it accessible for everyone so that you have teams that know whether they can say no to a passionate project manager who's bringing them the 70th thing on the list. They can easily just say, nope, that's not the highest thing on the list. I need to work on number 3. So there are certain dimensions of value. When you're doing value scoring, the first thing you want to consider is what are those value drivers? It's not as simple as just saying we want to decrease cost or things like that. You want to have it something more specific. We want to decrease customer support calls. That means it's more usable, or it might mean that people are able to solve their own problems or things like that. So you want to think about real value drivers that are measurable and that can have some impact. And then you score it thinking about the weight. So you take each of those value drivers and you give them a weight. So some things will have a more weight than others. And then what is the impact of each epic to those dimensions? We'll show you what that looks like in a tool that we developed as well. So we call this the bang for your buck score. And the bang for your buck score is a simple calculation in a lot of ways. It's just take your value, divide it by size, and that's the bang for your buck. So you want to work on the things that give you the highest bang for your buck, and work less on the things that get lower bang for your buck or don't even work on them at all. So the way that this works in the tool is first you have your dimensions 1 through 5 here across the top. And each of those dimensions might be something like decrease customer support calls or increase page usage, something like that. Those are things that you would name and you all agree on what those are the drivers. And you might have between 4 and 7 of them. You don't want to have too many because then it gets really hard to score them and it's too complicated. If you have too few, you don't have enough really to work with. Each of those gets a weight, and you can see the weight here, the 5, 10, 10. So dimension 2 has more weight than dimension 1. And then each epic gets an impact score. So epic 1 has it's a 3 moderate impact for dimension 2, for example. And then the math is simple. It's just 1 times 5 plus 3 times 10, and you get a score of 160. Then you need to consider the effort and size, and that's where you want your architects there, your tech leads, people who can tell you what is the effort, what's the complexity of the work to get this done. And those are all going to be relative size. And your bang for your buck on this one is 3.2. And what that looks like when you do it holistically, on your whole, you want to get every initiative in your organization, is it looks like this. So you've got all the epics down the left side of this matrix. This is for Wonderland Adventure Park. Imagine you're working on an adventure park. It needs to increase family attendance. You need to increase average time in park, decrease operations costs. So all of those get weighted. And then every epic here, or every initiative or project, whatever label you're using, all of those initiatives get scored. And you do this relatively in each column. So all of the initiatives have that impact score, divide them by the effort and size, and your bang for your buck score, you can see really easily, they're colored here. The water play area and the sanitation improvements have the biggest bang for your buck. But then then you have an opportunity to really think about these things and make some trade-off decisions. That's why you want the right people in the room. If I look at improved family experience, which is the last one on the list, it's got the highest value score by far. It's 240 points. It's also got a high effort, so it's got a low bang for your buck score. So when you look at something like that, you have an opportunity to think, okay, well, can we carve off part of that? Maybe we split it and we get 150 value points for much less effort, and that bang for your buck score will go straight up. And so this is where you have some levers that you can pull, and you are communicating clearly on what your priorities are within your organization.
Yeah, and just real quickly, Sally, if I may, there's a question. There's 2 questions so far. I'll go ahead and answer one of them just because we're in the context right now. Greg's asking, it sounds and looks like a version of the safe WSGIF. That was actually one of our pre-planted questions that we had on the list for later if nobody asked it. So thank you for asking that. And yes, the concept is exactly the same. For me, WSGIF is one of the most unfortunate acronyms I've ever seen used in such an important concept. Like almost nobody understands when you say weighted shortest job first, what that actually means. But when you say bang for your buck score, generally that seems to resonate. I think what's different here, and if you really dig into SAFE's guidance, the safe guidance around cost of delay is really a great starting point. And what we have found in working with organizations is it's often helpful and more impactful to sort of add another layer of fidelity or granularity to how you're coming up with the value score, which is where this comes in. You know, this is a lean prioritization matrix, which is derived from Six Sigma. The first time I used this matrix, I want to say was probably first quarter of 2000. So what, like 8 years before Don Reinertson's book came out? It's based in lean. So, you know, if we're doing lean things, let's use lean tools to implement our lean portfolio approaches. And what I like about this, I do think it's very useful to sort of look at when you're coming up with what are your value drivers, make sure you're doing a gut check against cost of delay. You know, do you need a column for time criticality? In my experience, time criticality is a really dangerous, slippery slope because everybody starts making the argument that it's time critical and everything starts getting the same score. So it sort of becomes a wash. So not saying don't use it. I'm saying be careful how you use it. You know, things like risk reduction and opportunity enablement, definitely make sure that the factors that should be considered in your overall prioritization method, that those are reflected here. So I like using, you know, the different categories of cost of delay as kind of a gut check. The thing about this matrix, and I'll tell a very quick anecdote. In this example here, this is for an exercise that we built for the workshop that we did at Agile 2023 a few weeks ago. And for the broader workshop that we're building out for Agile Velocity. If you look at the fourth criteria there, increase hotel utilization, you might imagine a scenario, and a similar scenario happened to me in real life back in, I think it was 2004, where we were doing our business unit, you know, our big first stab at you know, what the annual plan should be comprised of. And literally at the end of day one, we had all the scores and I was loading them into the tool for us to then dig in the next morning. We got word overnight that the C-level said, you know, one of these strategic objectives we've decided to eliminate, just completely eliminate it. And everybody said, oh no, you're kidding me. We just scored like 75 things and now we have to redo it. I said, no, hold on a second. If you look at it in the context of this example, let's say that overnight between day 1 and 2 of a big prioritization offsite, the decision was made, hotels are not really core to our business. Like, we're going to divest. So increase hotel utilization, we're not going to do that. You go into this grid, you change that 10 to a 0 and hit enter, and your whole portfolio is automatically rescored. So depending on how you're doing cost of delay scoring, it's probably not quite that straightforward and easy. So I like having a few more levers, I find that it's helpful.
Yeah, and I would just add, and you kind of hit on this, Randy, but just to put a finer point on it, I find this to be more more actionable and more pragmatic. Like it's a little hard sometimes to answer the questions in cost of delay and to get everyone aligned on the risk reduction and the time criticality. Some of those things that, which one do we give the number to, because time criticality is the same and things like that. It's also reducing risk. So these are really specific to what is driving the value in your organization and for your customers. And so really thinking about, if we're trying to increase family attendance, which one of these is going to do that the most? If we're trying to decrease operational costs, sanitation improvements are going to do that the most. So it's much more tangible, I think, when you're answering these questions. And it's really powerful to do this in a room with. And this kind of prioritization matrix, just to answer the question someone asked for that number 70 in priority, which aspect of this would have caught and stopped it? This is definitely one of those things. If you draw a line saying, okay, we're not going to go more than 20 and teams are working on that number 70, then we have some communication that's clear to have and to ensure that. And if that VP had said, no, it is not number 70, and these are the 5 reasons why, then they're there to have that conversation and they can actually influence this. And maybe they could say, okay, I'm going to cut half the scope, and they would have gotten a higher bang for your buck score. And so this conversation and collaboration at the higher executive level is really how you avoid those kinds of situations. So that's how you stop things.
Yeah. And at the risk of, we're totally blowing our time box for this, but I'm making the call that we're just going to borrow from our Q&A window, because in context, it's more impactful, I think. Greg also asked, who determines the weight for each category? So in this example, this was just the example that we came up with, but you might imagine this would really be a C-level conversation. So from an overall organizational strategy perspective, what are the key value drivers? What are our strategic goals that we're trying to accomplish? What are the different things that, if we make investments that hit on these levers, that they have the most impact on us achieving our strategy? And the fine tuning of these weightings, so aligning on what should the value drivers be, and then aligning on what's the weighting, right? We've got a number of dials that we're, and levers that we're trying to sort of calibrate to set in, because if we do that top part right, we should be able to throw any investment in the top of that funnel and have the right things come out at the bottom in the right sequence. So one of the conversations we often have is, things like Sally mentioned earlier, technical debt. Well, we should really make sure that the way we've calibrated our value drivers and our weights, that if there are valuable technical debt related investments that we should make, that those things should have, they should be considered, the phrase I like to use is, they should be considered a first-class citizen alongside with, quote unquote, business initiatives. So I'm a big fan of trying to calibrate these criteria to be holistic overall, so that you don't have to have a whole separate conversation around, like, okay, now how do we squeeze this technical debt in, which it always ends up creating a lot more friction in the system when you have that kind of a model.
All right, so I'm gonna move us on, because we do want to get to the next part of this presentation. So just to wrap this part up, and there are a couple of questions that we'll come back to in the Q&A. I can see a couple of other good ones, but the goal here really is to optimize for value delivery. We want quick decision making, pursuing value optimization with the lowest needed investment. That's that value over size, and that those decisions are made jointly. Where you have existing policies and procedures that get in the way of this kind of way of working, change them And if that's hard to do because you have a leader that doesn't believe in prioritization, or you have other inertia in your organization, just keep trying to influence them and show various ways that you can put some of these levers in place.
All right. And the third stop funding the work instead of the value. So another anecdote to share, I was working with an organization that was coming out of planning for their next big increment of their sales platform. And IT had in their goals around the sales platform for that year to onboard 10 new applications onto the sales platform. The corresponding business goal that the business side had was to drive increased utilization of the sales platform. So what happened was during the planning event, the business people looked at the impact of the applications that they had onboarded onto the platform so far and said, this is not moving the needle. And given the feedback that we're getting, doing more application onboarding is not going to help. We've got some really serious usability problems, and we could have 20 applications onboarded. It's not going to help us drive the increased usage of this new sales platform. So they made the decision to pivot. When word got up to the IT VP that no more applications were going to be onboarded for the coming quarter, and they'd only done 4 of the 10, and this was like the last full quarter before the end of the year, he understandably was he was blowing everybody up. What's going on? Why are we completely missing the mark on these goals? And luckily it didn't take too long. I've seen it take a lot longer, but within the course of a couple of hours, the right conversations ended up happening so that it was understood, okay, you put in your goals, onboard 10 apps. What's really important is drive usage of this platform. We have decided there is something different we should do to help us achieve that outcome. And a lot of times in a lot of organizations, the funding can be really tightly coupled with what is the work we're doing. I've seen that situation where it's like, well, yeah, but like, here's all the hurdles we have to jump through and hoops to try and like repurpose what this funding is for. Sally, did you have something you were going to add?
Nope, go ahead.
Okay, sorry. So how do we do that? The first thing we want to start doing is lean budgeting. And what we mean by that is we want to decouple the dollars from what we're going to do. And we want the dollars to be tied to what impact are we going to have. So in this simple but elegant diagram, on the left, you see we got a bunch of projects, and the projects are very specific around here's the things we're going to do. Sure, they have the impact that we want to have, but in a lot of environments, I've seen it time and time again, we really just start to lose the focus on what impact should this be having. And the overwhelming focus is on, we have defined the work, these dollars are for doing this work. We are doing this work and getting it done. So on the right, you can see we've got these different organizational structure where we've got 5 different value streams, different customer segments, maybe some of these segments include things like internal or maybe Salesforce. Maybe we've got like a whole partner network that, is a part of our selling process, but thinking about who are we serving and how are we trying to help them, and let's fund those things and then figure out how we can do the work that's more focused around how do we deliver what those people need, and making sure that we've got the right team structures. So within those new simplified columns from the last picture, we've got the right team structures to do that. And we start to really have less coordination overhead across internal functionality silos and have more of a focus around who are our customers and who are we trying to deliver to. And with that funding, that we're enabling local autonomy. So the story that I told, that should have been a non-event. The people that made the decision, like, we're not going to onboard more applications, we're going to focus on usability, they had the insight, they had the right feedback from the users, and they made the right decision. So let's make sure that we don't have policies and procedures and governance that is sort of like pouring concrete around our feet, so that if we need to make a different move, we have to go find a big hammer and chisel to like figure out how to break the concrete before we can do something different. And then lastly, reward impact. Like, stop rewarding, we got the project done and it was on time and it was on budget. Well, did you miss a key value assumption? Did you do the thing like in the first story I told where, had you invalidated some incorrect assumptions, you could have stopped working on something sooner and done something different, rather than take all the way to market launch something that resulted in zero revenue impact. Make sure that that impact is the primary focus and not simply following the process and getting things done. So here's another tool. The slide up above, when you get the slides later, I would encourage you, the 8 questions that we had on that slide, take those questions and look at the reporting and metrics that you are using today and ask yourself, does what we're using today drive these conversations? And this is sort of like the other side of that coin, which is, more often than not, we are showing up with, here's the project level variances, here's the schedule variances, here's where we are from a resourcing perspective, those kinds of things. So you can go through and answer these questions and do some rough back of the napkin math, if you will. But what are the things you're tracking at a project level today? How much time and energy does it take to set up in your current systems a new project, so that, if you have a funding allocation that needs to take place, what needs to happen to set that up, to set the people up on it? How much time and energy? How much effort goes into the monthly updates? How long does it take to create the kinds of updates for a given project that go into these more strategic reviews that you're presumably having? And then how much effort do you take to close out of projects? Sort of answer these questions, and for the monthly updates, multiply that by the average duration of a project, and then multiply all of that by how many projects you have on average. And that can start to help you see the impact of that product aligned, lean budgeting and portfolio management approach, where we worked with one organization that they had, 45 to 50 projects, typically year in, year out was about their average, 6-month average projects. When they looked at the answers to all of these things, and they said, oh, we get to stop doing a lot of that and stop tracking it for 45 to 50 projects and start focusing on tracking it across 5 different product areas, if you will. They found that it was almost going to be a 10% savings just of overhead, tracking overhead, that they were able to really eliminate that waste from how they worked. And when it comes to the lean budgeting, the ultimate punchline here is the focus on value. So understanding what value is, the customer alignment, whether it be an external, market customer, it might be internal customers, it might be partner network customers, but who are those customers? How do you align your teams to those customers? How do you fund in alignment with that? How do you implement continuous customer feedback? How do you get, understand these leading indicators, understand your assumptions, validate or invalidate them earlier and more often, and monitor your expected versus actual business value? So, understand our expected business value is this, but we just invalidated, or maybe we partially invalidated a critical assumption. So, maybe we didn't take the $5 million thing down to 0, but maybe we took the $5 million thing down to $2.5 million. Now we've got a different investment decision to make. We don't automatically keep going forward. If the benefit of this from the revenue perspective is half of what we projected, would it still make the cut given the sunk cost so far? Maybe. Establish your lean portfolio management team. Again, that group that has the right people from a business and technology perspective. Implement that collaborative scoring approach. And really this last one, normalize and operationalize roadmap adaptability. We work with a lot of organizations where the roadmap, there's not even a conversation between the people doing the work and the people setting the roadmap. It's the roadmap is the roadmap. We got all these decisions being made with, maybe somebody's licking their finger and sticking it in the air to make some kind of a guess on which way the wind's blowing on how much of an investment something might be. But if we can start to normalize and operationalize when we're having these conversations, we likely are going to pivot. We're going to learn new things. The value is shifting as we learn. The size and the investment is potentially shifting as we learn. And don't just be 100% heads down focused on getting to done. We need to make it okay to say we were not entirely correct. We need to make it okay in some cases even to say we were completely wrong. And this last bullet I think is really important because culturally in a lot of organizations, I see it all the time where it's much safer to just say, well, this looks like it's the wrong thing, but there's no way I'm raising my hand to say that, because I know if at the end of the year, I can say I got this thing delivered, check, good job performance this year. Well, the thing didn't actually help anybody. That's okay, because I would have gotten in big trouble if I would have said this was the wrong thing to build when we were halfway through building it.
Yeah, you might even start to build the idea that it's not good if your roadmap isn't changing. You should be learning, you should be pivoting, you should be adjusting to the market.
Yeah. All right. So in summary, things we want to stop. We want to stop ignoring our critical assumptions. We want to start evaluating our hypotheses on a regular basis. Make that a part of every conversation. Where are our biggest sources of uncertainty? And what are we doing, short of putting it in production and crossing our fingers, what are we doing to validate or invalidate those hypotheses? From a portfolio governance perspective, stop working on lower things. That includes, as Sally said, don't work on number 70 on the list when the organization has the capacity to do 30 things. And optimize for value delivery. So that means making those critical decisions, coupled with trimming the tail of existing things. So if you only have a capacity to do 30 things, but you can trim the last 10% off of a lot of those things and say, we got to good enough and let's call this done, and we'll potentially take another stab at running the rest of this work back through as a new investment later. But for right now, we're going to go pick up items 31, 32, and 33 on the list. And, if you can get 95% of the value for 90% of the effort, that's a good trade-off. And then lastly, as we were just talking about, stop funding the actual work and being so specific about everything that needs to be delivered, and decouple that. in the book, Beyond Budgeting, they use the phrase separation of purpose. So make sure that we're separating the dollars that are allocated and that they're more associated with the impact or the outcomes that we want to deliver and not so tightly coupled with the work we want to accomplish. Okay. We borrowed some of the questions, time slots.
We did. I want to point out a great comment in the Q&A first from Steve Kellogg. He says, so many people look at sunk costs and use that to drive the decision to continue. This can help talk against that and help to pivot, which hits the nail on the head. I love that because it's so true. Like, well, we already spent so much money. We need to finish it, but it could continue to sink costs. So you need to kind of separate the sunk costs from the value that you're trying to deliver and make sure that you're focusing on the right things there. Thank you, Steve.
All right. We had a question. What if your leadership doesn't believe in prioritization? Trust me, I've seen it. And there are absolutely certain environments where different kinds of behaviors, find a new company. Exactly. A lot of it comes down to culture. There's certainly cultures where you'll get the really strong expert leader who, they know the space and they know what to do and they have all the answers. And Steve Jobs was probably one of those, but how many Steve Jobs are really out there? There's probably just enough of those kind of folks to make to create a bigger problem for the rest of us out there, because it's got to be well over 90% of the people who think they're the next Steve Jobs really aren't.
One of the things, Randy, that you and I often ask is like, what's one small thing that you can do? Like you very likely are not going to do all of these things next week. And don't go, I wouldn't even recommend you go in and say, do all of this week, but what's the first step that you can take? What has the lowest barrier to entry that you can do to start even the mindset of these types of things? The organization that I was talking about doing this with, it took 2 years of just talking about it and influencing and trying small things and introducing ways of thinking about priorities. Well, number 70 on the list, pointing that out, is that really the most important thing? Like, find every opportunity you can to just start moving that mindset, start moving the needle a little bit.
One of the questions, this is one of our, in all transparency, preceded questions, which is the kinds of questions you're suggesting we should be answering and discussing in these portfolio reviews are not supported by my current tooling. What should I do? And this is a consistent problem that we run into. Like, there are some tool options that are a little more aligned with some of these things. I think that the majority of tools at least have some aspect of risk associated with them. So, if you have a dashboard report that there's some kind of a risk indicator, I would at a minimum reimagine what we mean when we say risk, because a lot of those 8 bullets that were on that one slide that I would encourage you to take back and compare to the conversations you're having today, a lot of those can be framed around risk. But a lot of the way we think about and report on and talk about risk, for most, if we're talking about, let's say it's like a board level review conversation. A lot of times, whatever the risks are, unless you actually need somebody on the board to go do something, those conversations tend to be very quick. Like, we're super nervous because we don't really want to spend too much time talking about these risks. It's, okay, here's this risk and we have this strategy and here's the people who are focused on it. Okay, next. Like, we don't even want to talk about it. But we need to normalize thinking about risk in a different way, thinking about, the assumptions that we're making and the feedback that we're getting. And at a minimum, if you can sort of repurpose and reimagine what risk is, then that would be probably the leanest way to leverage whatever your current tool is to help drive the right conversations.
So
Yeah.
Patrick asked, so go ahead.
A good question here from Shoma. One small thing to work on: ask to align on what is value in our collective context. Absolutely. And that's one of the things that I love about the lean prioritization matrix is those value drivers and the conversation around that. It's so valuable. And if you get the right group of people having that conversation, I like to describe it as whatever that investment is up front, you're going to get probably tenfold the return internally in the inertia, in the noise, in the friction that exists in your system when you have different executives who don't necessarily share an aligned view on value.
So Patrick asked, how did you drive to consensus on the scoring? So there are different techniques you can use. One thing that I've used successfully is something like a planning poker type of application or usage where everyone gets their vote so that then they don't anchor to each other. If you do a blind vote that way, then you don't have everyone going, oh, well, the executive VP said it's a 9, so I'm going to say it's a 9. You want people to give their honest answers because that will drive really good conversation. And the goal is that everyone has to agree on what the value actually is. And so there are different facilitation techniques that you can use to drive the conversation and drive them to work with each other to come to one answer, and really to ask questions and drive that conversation.
We really appreciate your participation and the great questions, and don't hesitate to reach out to us on LinkedIn to continue the dialogue.
Yeah, thanks everyone.